All right, let's go to 1 Peter chapter 4. That's where we left off last week. And we are around about verse 12. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12. And as I told you last week, we're going to be doing a little bit of jumping back to the first chapter today, just a little bit of it. And there's some other passages I'd like to look at from the second and third chapters as well. Because whenever you're studying any book of the Bible, whether it's a gospel account, whether it's the law, whether it's a history book, whether it's a book of psalm or poetry, or what you have, New Testament with letters and things like that. The authors of those books had a purpose in their writing besides just telling the narrative or telling the story or giving an account. There were motives that they had in writing. That's why we have 4 different gospel accounts. Each one is telling about the good news concerning Jesus, sure. But each one also has another motive that they're trying to, that they have in writing, which is why they have no qualms with reordering some details, putting some things at the beginning or at the end and all this. Because the New Testament writers were writing to people trying to make a point. Old Testament writers too. This is why you have 1st and 2nd Kings and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So what we have in 1 Peter chapter 4 is Peter's building upon what he's already laid in chapters 1 through 3. But the way that we typically read the Bible is we jump straight to chapter 4, right to verse 12, and read as if it's a brand new reading that we've never read or never looked at or never studied before. We're just going right to chapter 4, verse 12, as if the book begins there. And if you do that, then you miss out on the fun of studying the Bible, and that is seeing how everything connects and seeing how the arguments are building upon each other and all these sorts of things. So we're going to do just a little bit of that tonight. We're going to notice just a couple passages, I think 2 or 3, from the first few chapters of 1 Peter to show how this is a progression of thought. This isn't just a standalone text. So here's what he says. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or a thief or evildoer or a troublesome meddler. I like what the King James Version says, a busybody in other men's matters. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. So we're going to go ahead and look at those few verses tonight, maybe a little bit more depending on what we do. But he starts off talking about this fiery ordeal that was among them. And when you go back and you look at 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, that's what we read about there. He says, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, so their suffering wasn't going to be long, just a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So there's a couple things that you might notice similar between these two. One, he's talking about this ordeal, this trial, this fiery trial that they're having to go through. He points out that this is for their testing, this is for their purification, and he also has a reference there to the revelation of Jesus Christ towards the end of this passage as well, as he does in 1 Peter chapter 4. The word revelation, which you can't read it online, I got an update to my app and they haven't fixed all the little details about it yet. But the word revelation in both of these passages comes from a Greek word, which is apocalypsis. Apocalypsis. And if you were to, just sort of spell that out in English, you'd get something that looks kind of like the word apocalypse, right? Which is the title of Revelation. The book of Revelation title is Apocalypsis. And so, Peter and John have similar ideas in mind when they're both writing their books, right? So what he's really focused on, though, here is this little while period of trial, of temptation, of suffering that God took advantage of as an opportunity for their testing and for their purification. And notice that again, their their faith is more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire. So fire is, of course, used to take out impurities from precious metals such as that. And so that's what's happening here with the church with all these churches spread all around. I was going to say one, but there's like a bunch of them. So here's one of the things that we also read in 1 Peter chapter 2 that sort of sets the stage for what we're reading here. He says in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21 and following, he says, "You have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled," means people speak evil of him, right? "He did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you've returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls." So this little passage, 1 Peter 4, 21 to 25, sets the stage for what we read in 1 Peter 4 as well, because he talks about sharing in the sufferings of Christ. Just as Jesus didn't give them any excuse at all to continue to persecute them, these Christians weren't to either. Even though they were being spoken evil of, they were not to turn around and give evil back. Even though they were being threatened, they weren't to utter threats themselves. They were to be submissive, even to the point of death, to show the people that there was a greater way to live. Now, let's see. Where am I? Oh, 1 Peter 4. Going back to chapter 4 in 1 Peter, we have this again. So, the fiery trial was for their testing. And he said, don't be surprised about this. The reason why he told them not to be surprised is because of what he talked about in the previous passage. He said that that the individuals that they had left, that were still living lives of destruction, that hurt people and brought pain upon themselves and all this sort of thing. He says, in all of this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excess of dissipation, and they malign you, which is just another way of saying they speak evil of you. The word dissipation means riot, excess, basically just all manner of all manner of evil and wastefulness. And so he's telling them that they're not going to be surprised that they're being suffered, that they're being persecuted. But these others who are persecuting them, they are surprised. They're surprised that these Christians weren't willing to continue to living in the lives that they were living prior to their conversion. And that was one of the sources of their persecution. Because whenever an individual tries to do what's right, they let their light shine, as we talk about. John discusses in John 3, recording some words of Jesus, that darkness hates light because darkness is exposed by light. So if a kid in class is acting good, right, that makes all the bad kids look bad, because sometimes a teacher might say, everybody needs to be doing what Laura's doing, and all the other kids start grumbling, there's goody two-shoes over there, whatever. Even though the kid's not done anything wrong, they begin to look for faults in them, even make up faults about them to make themselves feel better. And this is just kind of how the world tends to operate. So he tells them, don't be surprised about the fiery ordeal among you. This is an opportunity for you to test your faith. This is an opportunity for you to grow. And he tells them in verse 13 that basically any amount of suffering that they were currently enduring would be nothing compared to the inheritance that would be given in Christ. He says the revelation of his glory. You may rejoice with exultation there in verse 13. And so their suffering would eventually give way to joy, but it was a necessary, as he said in 1 Peter 1, period of a little while of suffering. Let's see, verse 14. He says, if you're reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. In other words, one of the ways to tell if you're doing something right, and it's not always the way to tell you're doing something right, but if a lot of people think poorly of you, and you're doing the right thing, Sometimes it's a good indication that you're on the right path, right? I remember one time in high school, we had to run 3 miles around the block a big block, which I lived in the middle of the country, so a block was like, that takes forever to get around. Not like what we have here, it takes you a couple minutes. And I always tried to run as fast as I could. And some of the other guys were like, you're going to make us look bad because you're running so fast. Our times are going to be so slow compared to yours. You got to slow down. And then they pressured me to slow down and run at their pace. But that's kind of what's happening here, you know. They're trying to bring them down to their level because it make them look bad, right? They're being good members of society, even submitting to the kings and to the governors and things like that, as he talked about in the previous text. So it's making them look bad. And this is one of the sources of that persecution, jealousy. So he says in verse 15, make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or troublesome meddler, right? Now why he has to say that is because whenever we get into a situation where things are looking down, things aren't going the way that we want them to, you know, we might have slipped up here and there and we feel sort of bad about ourselves. We might be tempted to kind of continue down that path because we think, well, we're already here, might as well, do X, Y, Z, whatever our vices or temptations are. And we justify it because we say, well, things aren't going well anyways, might as well submit to whatever destructive behavior, it might be. And so sometimes we almost give up. So whenever they're being persecuted, taken to prison, beat, dragged out of their house, some of them might be tempted to say, well, they're already doing it to us, might as well have fun while we're at it, But he tells them, make sure none of you suffers as a murderer, as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a troublesome meddler. In other words, don't give them any excuse to actually persecute you, right? Don't give them any excuse to justify what it is that they're doing. Let's see. Well, there's an example, but that one's kind of maybe not the best example. Oh, here we go. Here's one. So you have protesters, right? Protesters, constitutional right, walking down the street, peaceful protesting, okay? But what happens? What happens eventually in some cases? Somebody picks up a brick, cracks a window, busts a car, takes a baseball bat, hits a police car, something like that, loots a store. Then what happens to the entire protest? It's now they can justify, not listening or casting them all in the same light, right? You see? One apple spoils a whole bunch, right? So this is what Peter's trying to get them to not do. You keep on the path that you're supposed to be on, because if you give them an excuse, then they're going to paint the entire church like that, and then they're going to have an opportunity to persecute you, to cast you out, to put you in prisons, to stomp it out, to have some reason to take before Caesar to find a legitimate authority to put them to death, right? So they can't bring down everybody else by getting down to their level, So he says, do not suffer as a murderer, as a thief, as an evildoer, or as a troublesome meddler. But he says, if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed. Hold your head high in court. You've done nothing wrong. You've done nothing wrong. And understand that your willingness to live like that is bringing glory to God, because you're an encouragement to everybody else who feels like sometimes it's too tough to live that way, who might be afraid of suffering the same way you're suffering. You give everybody else hope is the idea here. Now, that's 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. And we kind of just stayed sort of at a bird's eye view. We didn't get into the weeds and look at all the specific words and things like that. But hopefully you get the gist of it. It's stuff that we've already covered so much already. There was another passage I wanted to look at. Let's see. Chapter 3 and verse 17. He says, it is better, if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong. Again, don't give them an excuse to persecute you. Don't give them an excuse to validate themselves. It's like what Jesus talks about in turning the other cheek in Matthew chapter 5. When he was talking about that, and I've told you about this before, is that was a specific way that they could subvert the authorities, right? Because I've mentioned it to you before already, but he says if he strikes you on your right cheek, turn to him your left, okay? But if I am struck on my right cheek, they're not hitting me with a punch, because if you punch somebody with your right hand, you're not going to hit them on the right side, you hit them on the left side, right? Make sense? If someone's punching with the dominant hand, what's he doing? He's going to strike you on the left eye, on the left side, okay? Probably not going to hit you on the right, because that's what he's, got available to him. So when he says if someone strikes you on the right cheek, or right here, how is that done? It's a backhanded slap, right? Who slaps people backhanded? People that are in charge versus people that are supposed to be subservient to them. And so when Jesus says, turn the other cheek, if he strikes you on your right, turn him to the left also, what you're doing is saying, hit me harder, You're basically, it's a challenge to him. Do it again. Except this time it's not a backhanded slap, because you can't really, smack somebody that. So you turn it this way to try to, get them to give an open-handed slap, right? Give me all you got, basically. You think you're tough? Show me how tough you are, is basically what it is. And what that does is it exposes the person's violence in that culture. It exposes the person for what they truly were. Same with if someone asks for you to go with a mile, go with them too. The Roman military had the authority to compel someone who wasn't a citizen to carry their military gear for a mile. But they could only go so far. So what did you do? How do you show them, basically how do you embarrass them without being violent? You carry the armor 2 miles with a big smile on your face. So there you go, sir. You know what he's doing. Because once you get to that 1 mile mark, he's like kind of embarrassed, It exposes the system for what it is. So there's cultural things behind some of these things that we read that we're not really familiar with because we aren't living in that time. Like when he says if somebody sues you for your coat, give him your undergarment also. And we kind of talked about that one before. But what this was is if you had a loan out with them, borrowed some money, and what they could do is sue you for your coat. Well, who's going to do that? Sue you for your coat. That's a pretty despicable person that would do something like that, right? Sue you for the clothes off your back. So what Jesus tells them to do, in effect, is don't just give them your cloak. Just take off all your clothes and throw it there and walk out of the courtroom, no clothes on at all. That'll show them, right? What does that do? It embarrasses them. Because in the Old Testament, it was a shame to look on someone who was naked. Not just for the person who didn't have clothes on, but to even look on it was considered shameful. So you're bringing shame upon everybody there, showing them just how wicked it all is without having to strike, without doing anything, to promote that action towards you or to justify that action towards you. And that's what Peter's doing here in 1 Peter chapter 4. He's trying to give them encouragement to be willing to suffer with their head held high, knowing that they themselves haven't done anything wrong, right? And so that's really the force of the argument here. Does anybody have any comments on 1 Peter 4, 12 through 16?
Just add to back when you went to Matthew's 5, 6, maybe 10 and 12, where it says, "Let you against you persecute you."
That's right.
Now you against you.
Yes.
And then we look at the apostles. Was it Peter, James, and John that were being beaten because he was preaching, and they rejoiced on that behalf?
Yes, in Acts chapter 4, I believe it was. They were brought into the high priest, and Peter basically told them that they were the ones that prophecy was about, that rejected the stone. And let's see if that was in verse 13 of chapter 4, I believe it is. Let's see. They go and they heal someone, and then Peter and John basically says, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. We cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. So they threatened them further, but they ended up letting them go. He says in verse 21, because they found no basis on which to punish them. And then, and then they went out, and that's when they glorified God in verses 23 and following. They lifted up their voices in verse 24. See, that's right. That was Peter. Who was it? Was it Peter and John? Or was it Peter, James, and John? I didn't catch that part. It's just Peter and John. So Peter and John were the ones that were persecuted, and they went out and rejoiced because of it. And they didn't actually find anything wrong with what they were doing, which is what Peter's talking about. Don't give them any excuse to actually persecute you, right? They might persecute you, but don't validate what they're doing by misbehaving in some way. All right. You're trying, Miss Bond. You got it. You got it. Oh, he did. I didn't see it till at the end there. Okay, let's go back to 1 Peter chapter 4. Let's look at verse 17. This is we might have to get this into this passage in more detail later. But in verse 17, here's what he says. Here's why they're to glorify God. He says, "For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God?" Now, actually, I wish Ashley could have heard this part, because this is something she had asked about on Wednesday from 2 Thessalonians 1. But notice what he says there. It is time for judgment to begin, which is what he had said already in this passage before. If you look back to 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5, notice what he says. They will give account of him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Then he said in verse 7, "The end of all things is near. Therefore be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer." So, yes, ma'am. Yeah, it's hot. What do you want me to do about it? You can go cut the air on.
I thought it was just me being on.
No, it's not. I'm just burning up. But I thought it was because I thought it was because I was playing basketball this afternoon. Then I went and took a hot shower, so I thought I was just sort of still hot from all that. So I'm not going crazy. And your stove's broke, so you weren't heated up that way.
That's right.
All right. He says it is time for judgment to begin. So yeah, he said earlier in the passage, he's ready to judge the living and the dead. Then he said the end of all things is near in verse 7. And so he says it begins with the household of God, right? They were going through a tribulation, what he called a testing. And that's what a judgment is, just a decision that's made, right? So a decision was being made based on their response to the persecution. Would they take that as an opportunity to be actually bad people? Or would they take that as an opportunity to suffer with their head held high? Then he says, in other words, if we've got it bad, how much worse will it be for those who don't obey the gospel? In other words, how much worse will it be for those who are the ones doing the persecuting, right? It's bad for us. How much worse will it be for them? And that's basically the point of verse 17 here. The word time is the word kairos, if I remember correctly, which can mean the appointed time, the opportunity, the season, the set or the proper time. So it's the appointed time, it's the set time, it's the proper time for judgment to begin. He said this in verse 18. "And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner?" That is, if those who are righteous barely make it through this fiery ordeal, then how much worse will those who reject the gospel will be treated. And of course, what he has in mind here is this persecution that they were undergoing, and that was also knocking at the door of their persecutors as well. Dale?
What's the difference between ungodly and the sinner?
Sometimes what the Jewish writers would do is they would put two things that were the same thing right next to each other, just for a point of emphasis. It's called Hebrew parallelism. And so you might say in 2 Thessalonians 1, those who know not God and obey not the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. What's the difference between those two? Not really anything, right? So it's just a way to emphasize it. The godless man and the sinner, same thing. It's just called Hebrew parallelism. He uses two words or two ideas that are the same side by side to just make his point or to emphasize it. Sometimes we do that. We'll give lists of synonyms when we're just saying the same thing over and over. Like that is repetitive, redundant, and it repeats itself. Or something like that. Keith?
Is there any significance to why that entire verse is capitalized?
Yes, the entire verse is capitalized because that's a proverb. Proverbs 11:31. If the righteous will be rewarded in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? The implication there, as Peter points out, in his whatever that is, quotation of it, is that the sinner would receive something bad. as opposed to the righteous man that would have received something good. In my version of the Bible, whenever a New Testament writer is quoting something from the Old Testament, the translators put it in all caps to let you know. They don't catch all of them, but they do a decent job at that. He says, therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. In other words, this is kind of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10. Notice what he said in verse 28. He says, do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell, or the Greek word there is Gehenna, which was a literal fire pit right outside of Jerusalem where they burned garbage and things like that. So he says, do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. And so in 1 Peter 5, verse 19, that's basically the point of this passage too. He's saying that that those who suffer according to the will of God, they're putting their faith in God rather than in man, right? Instead of trusting any deliverance that person will offer. Because they might even say something like, well, if you just reject Christ now, we'll restore you, to a high place in the synagogue, give you the best seat in the house, or whatever. And that could be tempting for them to accept. But instead, they trust more in the promises and the blessings offered to them by God than they do by man. And that's an important lesson for us to know as well, because there's situations where it might be an unspoken thing, but I know of ministers right now who believe certain things about the Bible to be true, but they're unwilling to say those publicly because they know that the second that they do, they might lose their job. There's ministers I know of that I've talked with that believe different things about everything under the sun that you can think of that we typically make an issue in the church, within the church. And they don't speak out against those things or speak out about those things or voice their mind to anybody because they know that they would fear the check, or they would lose the check. So they have more fear for what man can do than what God can do to an extent. So I know that, God is willing to take care of any of us who put our faith in Him rather than ourselves or in our own abilities. And even if we lose our life or whatever it might be, we know that we have heaven as our home. And so what could be better than that? So 1 Peter chapter 4 is just an encouragement to them because they're being so severely persecuted. Christians today talk about how we're being persecuted in America, but our COVID restrictions are nothing compared to Nero taking people and making them torches in his garden to light up his garden at night. It's so silly that we compare such trivial things to what was going on there in the first century. Tying limbs to different horses and smacking them, things like that. Those are things that Christians had to endure. And we trivialize those things whenever we compare their suffering to what we face in America. Now, sure, there are Christians around the world in various nations that are hostile towards anybody with religious beliefs that are enduring those sorts of things, right? But here in our country, very rarely does that happen, if at all. So 1 Peter 4 is dealing with real people, real problems, real suffering. They needed some sort of relief, and Peter encourages them, look at it like a test. Look at it as a way to grow, which is what James talks about as well. Okay, anybody else have anything on 1 Peter 4 all the way up through verse 19? Okay, we're in the last chapter of Peter now, chapter 5, and we're going to be looking at that next week, but we're going to be looking at the role of elders in chapter 5 and verse 1 and following, or the role of shepherds, as he calls them here as well. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of elders, or the role of shepherds, because of the way that our Bibles have mistranslated some key words in passages about leadership in the church. And we're going to take a look at some of those next week, specifically from Hebrews chapter 13 and a couple passages in Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus as well, if I feel like that's something that we ought to do. But I do want to look at the one in Hebrews 13, because a lot of people look at the eldership almost as a dictatorship. and not as leaders who lead first and foremost by example. And so that's one of the things that he says in 1 Peter chapter 5 is, nor yet is lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. So we'll get into that discussion a little bit next week. Anybody else have anything? I need to be careful. Every time I do this, I sling coffee just inside the cup there, but it gets all in the rim of the cup. All right. In that case, we'll go ahead and stop that there. And if nobody else has anything, we'll be done with that section. It's so difficult when you're near the end of a chapter. You don't want to jump into the next discussion because there's so much to be said. But you want to finish that chapter, you know. And so it's like, what do? Do you just ramble for 15 more minutes, make stuff up to say to keep everybody in their seats until the allotted time? Or do you just say, well, we've reached the end of the chapter, let's move on, you know? What do? Don't want to jump into the next discussion. So my thought is, well, there you go. Good job. 10 minutes early. Because I can make stuff up about all about you. We got all kinds of verses about fiery trial, and look at Mark 9 and all these passages. What's the point? What did that do? That wouldn't help you understand 1 Peter 4 anymore. That just